Hi, well, look, everyone, thank you so much for your patience while we work through some technical challenges, but we're really glad that all of you were able to join us today for this webinar. I think we have most of the attendees now trickling in, so thanks again for your patience. So without further ado, let's get started today. So my name is Matthew Costello, and I'm the CEO of Voyager Portal, and we're really pleased to welcome you to this webinar to discuss the impacts of the Russian-Ukraine war on shipping markets. For those of you first time to this conferencing medium, please note that the webinar will be recorded and distributed for anyone who is unable to attend today. And also at the end of the webinar, we're going to be leaving time for questions. So feel free to post your questions in the Q&A button down the bottom. And any questions that we don't have a chance to answer, we'll circulate to our panelists today to try to answer after the webinar. So just very quickly, for those of you who do not know Voyager Portal, our software platform is used to manage bulk marine supply chains more efficiently and intelligently. So if your team is struggling with schedule reliability, increasing freight and demurrage costs, or just buried in emails and spreadsheets, then Voyager is there to help. And today I'm really excited to be joined by two extremely knowledgeable people on this topic, far more knowledgeable than I, Tony Foster and Gihan Ismail. Gihan and Tony, thanks for joining us today. Gihan, would you like to go first and provide us with a brief introduction of your background?
Sure. My name is Gihan Ismail. I have been at Marine Capital for coming on to 10 years now. Prior to that, my background was in the investment management field. So I spent a number of years on the investment consulting side and also working for asset managers before I joined the shipping industry.
Great. And Tony?
So Tony Foster, I've been in the shipping industry all my life, which is a very long time now. And I have been always working on the commercial side of shipping as a ship owner, manager, operator, asset manager, ship manager, just about all the commercial roles that people have had in the shipping industry. I've had most of them over the last generation, and most recently, our business is an asset management business.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So let's kick it off today with the first question. So, obviously the war has had a huge impact on shipping markets across a number of sectors. So maybe we can kind of start at a really high level. What are some of the most obvious effects on the shipping markets? And maybe Tony, if you want to kick us off with this one.
Sure. So I think the thing about the effects on the shipping markets is that you have to look at the big picture of all the effects from everywhere. So, we have the Russia-Ukraine war in one part of the world, and we have the Chinese COVID lockdown in the other. And a lot of things are interacting at the same time, which is always the case in shipping. In general terms, what we're seeing is some weakening in the container market. The container market is very closely related to global GDP. And there's been a considerable drop in the Shanghai index, for example. I think it was down more than 30% when I last looked. Liquidity is probably drying up in the secondhand ship market. And at the same time, the container lines have got lots of ships on order. So going forward, the medium term is certainly more challenging than it is now. On the dry market, the immediate effects of the crisis have been probably neutral. Freight rates are roughly speaking the same, but there's plenty of optimism in the dry cargo market. The question there is whether, for example, Ukrainian volumes of grain can be replaced from other sources. And the big picture on that is that we'll probably see less commodity moving, but over longer distances. So roughly speaking, a balancing out of ton miles. The tanker markets are very optimistic. We've seen a big jump in product carrier rates. The crude markets are still languishing, but again, there's plenty of optimism. And I think your audience will probably have read that the famous Mr. Fredrickson is trying to buy Euronav. He's also having a go at international seaways in the US. While nobody knows exactly what he's doing, it's undoubtedly backed by belief that the tanker market is improving, and he wants to get his hands on more assets. So those are the pictures in the main markets.
Thanks, Tony. And maybe a question around sanctions as a follow-up. Gihan, what about the sanctions that have been introduced by various governments? How are these affecting the shipping markets and ship owners?
So as you would expect, there's a lot of short-term disruption, particularly as entities try to understand what exposure they have to Russia and sanctioned entities. And of course, you've got the EU deadline of the 15th of May for everyone to wind up their operations, contracts, etc., with any exposure to Russia and entities that will be sanctioned. For example, on our ships, we don't have any exposure to Russia or sanctioned entities, but we have agreed with our charterers to exclude any Russia, Ukraine and Black Sea trade until we choose to reinstate it. In the tanker market, it's a lot more nuanced because there have been lots of owners that have made good money from moving oil cargoes quite legitimately. The EU, as you'll be aware, is trying to bring in a ban on Russian oil, but just this morning they actually stepped back from that extending to shipping activity because they've been lobbied by predominantly Greek but also Cypriot and Maltese ship owners. And as Tony said, the outlook in the tanker market amongst many tanker owners is quite optimistic because they believe that as governments have to source their energy requirements from different sources to Russia, that it's likely to come from further afield. But of course, as we've seen, security of energy supply is a key issue for governments, and it's also, I think, something that the EU has also been grappling with as it's trying to bring in this ban on Russian oil, because not all of its member states are in agreement, particularly those that are highly dependent on Russian oil. I think that also the other issue that has to be borne in mind is the availability of that supply. So even though sanctions as a whole may be positive for the tanker market because ton miles will increase, I think it's not quite so straightforward, because it's not a case that you can simply turn on the taps. I mean, for example, we've seen that OPEC and Saudi have so far resisted pressure to increase supply. So where that extra supply is going to come from, and the availability of extra supply, not just in oil, but also in other commodity markets like grains, I think will have to be seen. And then you've also got the issue of energy pricing. So Gazprom has many long-term contracts with EU buyers, which are priced well below current market spot levels, and defaulting on those contracts as a result of sanctions will simply leave Gazprom with the ability to find other buyers and be able to sell at prices that are higher than they currently have on those contracts. So in the end, Russia will gain from that. So sanctions only work really if you don't have the potential for other buyers to take the place of EU, US, UK entities. And as we've seen, there are plenty of other very large nations that are still willing to trade with Russia in order to secure their commodity requirements. And it's not just ship owners that are affected by sanctions, it's a whole host of other entities in the shipping market. So you've got brokers, you've got charterers, you've got insurance, the insurance industry, you've got classification societies. And I think all of these entities are quite wary of doing any Russian related business, even if it's not covered by sanctions, because as we've seen, the situation can change quite rapidly. And I think everybody is trying to grapple with what it currently means, what it could mean, and therefore, even if they're not necessarily breaking any rules by their sanctions, I think we've seen a lot of people that are just self-sanctioning and just not doing any Russian-related business at all.
Gihan, just kind of on that topic, you kind of mentioned how the trickle-on effects of the different players. We've had some questions in Q&A. You know, how would it affect other parties to the deal? So, for example, you know, brokers, for example, maybe some of the service providers who may not have been aware of the nature of the trade or the nature of the ship, for example. Is there potential for that risk to spill out to them as well in these deals? And is it sort of the thing where everyone needs to be just hyper aware?
I think there's definite potential for that. And I think the brokers, to take brokers as an example, they are very much aware. So I was talking to some friends this morning about broker friends about, for example, you know, what would happen if Russian ships came into the market for sale? And the response was, well, we wouldn't touch them. We wouldn't dare go near them. Yeah. So I think that is probably the prevalent attitude.
And I think also, you know, even if the EU has pulled back from sanctioning shipping and the transportation of Russian oil cargoes, if the insurance market steps back from that business, if the classification societies step back from that business, then in effect, you've got the sanctions regime there anyway. So it's just getting tighter and tighter. And I think because people are so wary of being on the wrong side of the sanctions regime, particularly the US, which is far more aggressive and far more far-reaching than the EU and the UK regimes are at the moment, most people are just not willing to take the risk, full stop.
Yeah. And maybe just kind of following up on this topic for you, Tony, you know, how do you see this activity, especially for Russian shipping companies and new building activities potentially playing out?
There's a lot of talk. It's really quite interesting. There's a lot of talk in the market about Sovcomflot in particular being, you know, the biggest international Russian shipping company. With a big fleet, which is trading internationally. They have a lot of joint ventures with other ship owners, European and Asian. They have a big order book in Korean shipyards. They have a lot of loans from European banks. So, you know, how is this all going to work? As Gihan mentioned earlier, we have the EU has a 15 May deadline for companies to unwind their relationships. You know, what that would mean in practice, I suppose, is a bank going to Sovcomflot and saying, you know, you're now in default because you're sanctioned, and we want to accelerate your loan. In other words, we want our money back this week. And that seems to me highly unlikely as an outcome, at least in most cases. So perhaps more likely is that where they have joint ventures, the JV partners would take over. And I think where they are not in JV, the lawyers are going to be very, very busy working out how this is all going to work, because nobody quite knows. If you're talking of an EU institution, then a bank, for example, I would guess that EU institution will go back to the ECB and say, look, we've passed the 15th of May. Yeah, what do you expect us to do? You want us to go and arrest all these ships or what? So it's to be seen, but it's messy. And the lawyers are going to be happy, I think.
Yeah. And do you see this, how this might impact, potentially the Korean shipbuilders, one of the other big major shipbuilding groups out there?
Yeah, so as I say, the Sovcomflot have a big portfolio on order in Korea, and probably the Koreans want to build those ships. The Russians are not in default under the building contracts. I would expect the Koreans have been inundated with phone calls from bidders saying, can we take these ships? So for example, the Russians have LNG tankers on order, which are probably at least $40 million in the money today. So clearly, if you could take over one of those contracts at contract price, you'd be very happy. So there'd be lots of people trying to do a deal with the Koreans, but at the moment, Korea hasn't sanctioned them. So again, without knowing everything, I would imagine that America would be pressing the Koreans to sanction them, and then the shipyards would only respond when their government tells them to.
Yeah. And Gihan, what about the other owners? I mean, the other tonnage providers out there, and how this might kind of play out in different contracts and charter parties?
Yes. Well, I mean, as a starting point, as a tonnage provider, I think the key thing is to ensure that you have the appropriate clauses in your charter party, such as the BIMCO sanctions clause. As you said, I think the majority of the ship owners do not want to be in breach of the sanctions. Of course, there are always some who are willing to go against that. Sanctions busting has been around for a while. And from what we understand from our P&I club is on the increase. And of course, there are various ways of getting around the sanctions. So some will always take that risk, but the majority of the others just simply won't. And so therefore, I think there are a lot of discussions that are happening at the moment between ship owner, i.e. tonnage provider, and charterers with respect to ensuring that the appropriate clauses are in there. Although, of course, as we said, for the majority, it will be the BIMCO sanctions clause that will hold sway. And of course, you've also got pressure, public pressure. So public companies in particular, I think, were some of the first to act with regard to sanctions, and indeed self-sanctioning even before the sanctions became broader. And indeed self-sanctioning can take a whole host of other forms. So in addition to ship owners, and charterers and brokers and so on and so forth refusing to have anything to do with any Russian related business, you could also potentially have other forms where, for example, you have ports refusing to load or unload vessels that have Russian crew. Although I think we have to say that we've not seen any evidence of this yet, but you can see that people are thinking about what this means for them and their business and not wanting to take any risks.
Yeah. And maybe kind of less obvious, what would you say are some of the kind of more less obvious side effects that are potentially going to happen broadly out there in the world, Tony, that perhaps people aren't thinking about?
Well, I think the crewing thing is one of them. We don't think that, I mean, people are probably not aware that Russian and Ukrainian crew constitute, I think it's 7 or 8% of the total global crewing market. So, I mean, that it seems highly unlikely, and indeed, perhaps, morally, maybe not appropriate either to sanction individuals because they happen to be seafarers and happen to be Russian. But we, for example, on our ships, typically have had a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian officers, and that's very common. European owners very commonly have Russian and Ukrainian mix. And I'm glad to say we haven't had any incidents, I mean, we haven't had fighting on board. But clearly we and others are separating them out so that we would have only Ukrainian officers or only Russian officers on a given ship. So that's something that people haven't really, cottoned onto in the rest of the world.
But I think there are other issues related to that, such as how you pay both your Russian and your Ukrainian crew, and also just logistical issues. So for example, with your Russian crew, getting them off the ship and where do they go after that? If they can't go back to Ukraine, where is it that they can go to? And Ukrainian crew that were going to join the vessels but no longer can, or it's just not logistically feasible to get them on board. So there are all these other logistical issues that come with that as well.
I think there's one very interesting big picture question, which is around what shipping does, what shipping is for. So if you are a cargo owner and you have a long-term cargo requirement, I think it's very important, depending on which sector you're in, you are aware of the need to secure the ships that provide the cargo for your business, whatever, like a power station, for example. So I think the strategic nature of shipping comes more to the fore when these issues start to arise. People start to think, well, hang on a minute, shouldn't I be perhaps thinking I need long-term cover? Shouldn't I perhaps be thinking that I should have ships exclusively so that I'm absolutely certain who is providing my cargo, where it's coming from, and that the ships are available for me? So I think that probably is a big picture. That is a development that people will be thinking about more, and I think they will, in principle, that could also be tied into a decarbonization argument, because again, if you're a long-term cargo owner, you will be thinking about decarbonization, and that will tie into new assets. So new assets, long-term contracts, strategic control, that all makes sense.
How do you think this will potentially play out for actual day-to-day consumers or farmers? The fertilizer prices have been going up. Combine that with potentially less ships available in the market, grain not being able to get out. Do you expect this will start to hit people's end of week shopping bill, and we'll start to see it come out in the sort of everyday consumer prices, or has it still got a long way before it kind of trickles through the system?
No question. It's already there, and it's going to be very painful. It's going to be particularly painful in less developed countries or countries who are, for example, very grain dependent. So North Africa, for example, Egypt in particular. Egypt is the world's biggest wheat importer. Morocco, Algeria, countries like this, big grain importers facing effective crisis. And probably the less obvious, or the thing that people have not really perhaps got their heads around yet is a food crisis. Apart from Western shoppers having a much bigger supermarket bill, that's obvious, and we will, as we have in the UK, potential huge increase in food poverty, which Western governments will have to do something about. But Western governments at least have the capability to address it. In less developed countries, it's a much more difficult question. And whether, if food crisis were to spill over into political unrest, then we've got more problems to deal with.
And is the same thing kind of playing out with energy prices? I mean, with LNG and crude and even kind of petrochemicals. And then in the US, we started to see higher gas prices. But I mean, how long before, have we kind of reached a peak there now that the US is kind of opening up some of its own resources, but OPEC's still holding off? So are we just kind of at the tip of the iceberg in terms of what this is going to do to energy prices?
I think I'm pretty sure there's an awful lot happening in the background. You only have to read about interaction with the Saudis or the Iranians to realize that there's a lot of pressure going on to improve supply. I think the thing that, again, we have to remember more broadly, if you talk about supply from established markets or Western markets like the US, you can't just turn on the taps. I mean, the supply doesn't come overnight. So, people are talking about LNG, and making up the difference in European gas, for example, with imported LNG. Well, that LNG isn't available as we speak. The time lag between making that available and importing it, and indeed either building the facilities to import LNG, which a lot of European countries don't have enough of, or indeed developing FSRU projects, that takes time. That's not going to happen in 12 months.
And also, I think in the meantime, there's the potential for demand destruction because of the price increases that we've already had, particularly if several economies tip over into recession.
Excellent. And so it sounds like challenging times ahead. I think we have a couple more minutes for any last questions if they don't trickle through. But Gihan, Tony, any last minute kind of additions or sort of thoughts that you think would be kind of helpful for people to take away with them today before we wrap up?
I think there's an interesting question from a selfish perspective about capital coming into the shipping markets. Will that be affected by all of this? And indeed, would it be affected positively or negatively? So in the current economic climate, globally speaking, investors are ostensibly turning to real assets, and ships are obviously real assets. Does this sort of headline or headlines make them more intrigued or less? Perhaps it's a dinner party conversation, but I would tend to think they might be more intrigued.
We just had one last question come through around, how do you see flows being impacted by the crisis? I assume the question is kind of more broadly around changes to traditional commodity flow patterns from this.
Yeah, so the simple answer or simplistic answer is that commodities tend to move from the nearest available competitive place. So over time, you buy your coal or your grain from the nearest place because that's obviously giving you the cheapest freight. And when those markets are disrupted, you have to move that commodity from further away, and that's going to cost more. So you get more ton miles in the market, which is why people always say war is good for shipping. And that's the simple answer, simplistic answer. But obviously there are nuances depending on the specific commodity and where the alternatives are.
Great. Well, we're exactly on time. So Gihan, Tony, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for everyone who joined and the Q&A that was submitted afterwards. We'll be providing the contact details for Gihan and Tony to everyone who signed up today. So if you have more questions, by all means, feel free to reach out to them. Thank you very much, and we'll be sending the recording shortly. So have a wonderful day, everyone. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.